Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome. This is your AP World History teacher, Ben Osborne. Such a great time here today looking into our Unit 3. So we're moving on a little bit from Unit 2 and the Mongols and all that stuff that's going on before about 1450 or so. And we're moving into our next time period. So our next time period is roughly 1450 to 1750. Now, the content shifts around a little bit here. So, for example, we'll be talking about sort of the decline a bit of the Mughal Empire or the Safavid Empire, but they actually last for quite a bit. So, we're kind of loose on our times there. But this is the time period when these gunpowder empires, these empires are going to be so big. So this whole unit basically is about a whole bunch of different groups that are out there, like different empires like France and England, but also the gunpowder empires like the Ottomans and, the Ming and other groups as well. So this initial 3.1 is kind of just a survey of looking over a number of these different empires. Later on, some of the specific issues and problems and things in these empires will be in 3.2, 3.4, all that kind of stuff. But in the meantime, we're going to take a look today at 3.1 and kind of give ourselves a nice little overview of what's going on around the world with these empires. So again, we're starting here, time period 2. This is about 1450, and we're looking around the world at a couple of these different empires. All right, so our first empires here are going to be our gunpowder empires. So these gunpowder empires are called that for pretty obvious reasons, right? They use gunpowder. So gunpowder was created by the Chinese a long time ago, but the problem with it was that it wasn't initially very refined. So it had a tendency to sort of not go off or get wet very easily or some other problem like that. But the bigger problem with gunpowder was that there was no metallurgy to contain it. The problem with it is that if you create a piece of metal that you're going to make into a gun, and then you put a bunch of gunpowder in it, and you set it off, if the metallurgy isn't so good, you basically just made a bomb. You didn't make a gun or a rifle. That cannonball is just going to explode in the thing and kill everybody who's trying to shoot it. So the problem for a lot of these, for the Chinese and a lot of other groups, is how do we do that? How do we make it so that we can project these things instead of just having them go off? And so around this time period, 1300, 1400, whatever, we start having metallurgical techniques that are a bit better. So that means that these empires can create guns that are going to be more beneficial. They're going to be guns that are more useful, and things that are going to help them out a lot, so that they can start basing their militaries around the use of this gunpowder. So the problem then comes that you have to understand basically that these are not like modern weapons. These are not like machine guns or anything like that. They're primarily sort of one shot, and then you need to reload them. So these guns are kind of weak, initially. They're not particularly great, but you are able to create a pretty powerful military system based upon this use of gunpowder. So we're going to see here 3 gunpowder empires in the initial phase here. These are our 3 Muslim gunpowder empires, but we'll also be checking out a few others as well, like the Ming and Russia and other places. Typically speaking, a gunpowder empire is going to be one that uses guns extensively, and that's primarily going to be these 3, though. So taking a look here, we have the Ottoman Empire. This is sort of during the height of these different empires. So we have the Ottoman Empire there that is based around Istanbul, which for some reason is labeled Constantinople on this map. So you can see it is massive during its time. Rivals the Roman Empire. It's all over the Mediterranean, different areas. We will then have its rival, the Safavid Empire, who we'll talk about more in a minute. And then lastly, the Mughal Empire, not the Mughal Empire. This is not Harry Potter, guys. That is a word that sounds suspiciously like Mongol, and there's a reason for that. They are essentially building upon the Mongol heritage that they have in order to get some kind of press or whatever, that kind of stuff, trying to get it so that people like them and use that power as a part of what they're doing. Okay, so let's take a look at a couple of these specific empires then. So starting off here with the Ottoman Empire. So the Ottomans are going to come in the wake of the Seljuk Empire. If you remember when we talked about the Seljuks, they are going to be this group of people who are essentially kind of Highland, kind of mercenaries basically that work for the Abbasid. So they are much like the Germanic tribes in Rome. They come in, they work for a while for the Abbasids, but then they overthrow them essentially, or they kind of keep them in power, but they run things day to day. So the Seljuks then are going to have a large, powerful empire that is in this area, but they cross the number one people you don't want to cross, the Mongols. And so in the process then, they are essentially defeated by the Mongols, and then there's a power vacuum. So into that power vacuum then comes another group of Turks. Okay, so the Seljuks are Turks, but this other group of Turks is founded by a guy named Osman, and that's kind of where we get the name Ottoman from. It's a long story how that exactly comes about. But regardless, that's sort of where it comes from, is these names that are involved there. I think it's like his father or something, but that's where it comes from. So Osman's going to found a new dynasty of Turks, and those Turks will essentially move into the power vacuum that is left by the Seljuks. Now, it's not immediate. They don't like pop in and 20 years later they're in charge of Constantinople. It in fact takes a very long period of time for them to do this kind of stuff. So modern day Turkey today, that country of Turkey, serves as the core of the empire there. And Istanbul will eventually be the capital. But that's going to take a bit of time. It's not until 1453 that takes place. So it takes a couple hundred years basically for them to sort of like get powerful and become very powerful until that point. Now, the Ottomans are going to politically be controlled by a sultan, who is essentially effectively a king or an emperor. And one of the ways that they're going to do that then is through this group of people called Janissaries. So here's the problem for the sultan, right? The Turks are like a highland warrior group. So as they're going from place to place and conquering territory, they're getting like territory, they're getting little areas for them to kind of like conquer and rule. But the problem then is that they have a lot of independence because they have this established idea. So it's kind of like our feudal systems, you know, like the local knights and stuff have a lot of independence, but in the Ottoman Empire, at least, they tend to be a little more independent than you would see in other places. And so they're forever having these issues, like how do you deal with these like warrior groups, and how do you get them to do what I want, and how do I prevent like uprisings and stuff. So one of the ways they decide to do this then is that the sultans decide to create a force of people that is only loyal to the sultan. Like they are 100% reliant upon the sultan. So these lower level people, emirs and things like that, they have land, they have troops of their own, so they can rely upon that. And so the difference then is that the sultan's janissaries are going to be created purely for him. So these are what are called slave soldiers. We've talked about slave soldiers, and we talked about the Mamluk a little bit before. I think a lot of times my students are confused as to like, if you're a slave and you have a gun, like why wouldn't you rise up? But don't forget that, you know, there's also sort of some benefit here too. This is not like the slaves that we think of when we think of transatlantic slave trade. Like it's not good. You're still owned, obviously. Like I always say, slavery, every kind is bad. But you have a bit more benefits in some ways. And so these slave soldiers were largely okay with sort of their situation in life. So they're going to be recruited, though, these janissaries, by Christian children. So what they essentially do is when the Ottomans control areas that have Christians, so particularly the Balkan area, they will go to that area, and then they will take them in what's called the devshirme. So they will basically go to a town and say, we need tribute. It's very Hunger Games, actually, now that I think about it. But instead of being taken to the capital and forced to fight against each other and dogs or whatever the heck was going on there, they instead are brought to Istanbul, and they are trained to be military soldiers. They convert to Islam, and then they become this amazing warrior caste, right? So the benefit then is that the Sultan, they only rely upon the Sultan. That is who's paying their salaries. That's who's keeping them around. So if they go against the Sultan, then they're in a lot of trouble. The downside to that whole experience, though, is that the Sultan is also dependent upon them, right? So if the Sultan is dependent upon them, they can really push a lot against them. And so that's what we're going to see over the long run, is that these janissaries are really going to push against the central control of the Ottoman Empire and the Sultan, and that's going to cause them a lot of problems in the long run. Now, along the way, though, we have a number of different Ottoman sultans who are particularly great and powerful. So we have Suleiman the Magnificent, for example. He was the most famous of these sultans. He will besiege Vienna in 1529. Another really fascinating historical moment. If he had been able to take Vienna, what might have happened? His empire is run by a group of people called viziers. I think that's where we get the word advisor from, but it sounds very similar regardless. So these are essentially advisors. These are like groups of people to help out. If you remember... Yeah, we're going to go into some Disney here. If you remember Aladdin, I think Jafar, right, the bad guy, was a vizier who was supposed to help out the Sultan. So these are assistants, basically, people who give advice. These guys are at the center of world trade, but one of their big problems is that they are hurt by New World silver. So as the Spanish and so forth go to the Americas, they are going to bring back silver, and so that's really going to hurt the Ottoman Empire because they have large silver mines. They also do a lot of trade, and so that will end up hurting their economy. Additionally, it's a Muslim country, and it has a lot of influence from these Muslim clerics who are extremely conservative. And so what happens then is that as Europe is expanding, creating more weapons, creating more ways to fight their enemies, the Ottomans are kind of left behind a little bit, and they don't really want to deal with those things. So here's a picture that'll show you kind of basically the size of the Ottoman Empire at its height, so you can see sort of how it's added. So at various times then, you'll see some expansion. So for example, Izmir here is one of their capitals very early on. They're going to expand a little bit here and there. But then by, let's see, Mehmed the Conqueror, who is the guy who conquers Istanbul, Constantinople, you can see some of the additions and things that they're getting. And then basically by 1699, they're essentially at their height. Like these are the largest areas that they have been, and they will rapidly decline after this period, after 1699. All right, next up, a very similar empire, but also very different. These are called the Safavids. Okay, so the Safavids are kind of fascinating. They're something you don't hear about a ton. Like I'd heard about the Ottomans, the Mughals before, but when I started teaching this class, I learned more about the Safavids, and they're kind of interesting. So the Safavids are effectively where modern-day Iran is, right? Like it's Iran and a little bit of Iraq, the sort of Shia part of Iraq, and that is their major empire. So it is the most powerful of the Shia empires. In fact, it's really kind of the only one. So if you remember, Islam is divided into Sunni and Shia, largely based around this early question over who should lead. But by this time period, in 1500s or whatever, that's a long distant memory. It's more about different interpretations of Islam, and they just have different beliefs basically, and they consider each other kind of apostates almost, like not quite like heretical, but not fond of each other in a lot of ways. So what happens then is that this whole area was sort of underdeveloped, and this guy named Ishmael will come out of the highlands at the age of 14. So what are y'all doing with your lives? I know I'm way past that time, but comes out at 14 and conquers this territory with some of his highland warriors and organizes it around a specific type of Shia called Twelver Shiism. So Twelver Shiism is the belief that there is a 12th imam who effectively like disappeared. Imam is like a religious leader. So there's like 12 of them. The last one then disappears, and they believe that he is the hidden imam and that he will return one day. So it's almost messianic in a sense. It's almost about like the return. There's a lot of like religions that do this. Like Christianity has a lot of these kind of things as well, so it's not unusual. But this particular one is pretty powerful as sort of an organizing influence of the Safavid Empire. The peak of this empire is under Shah Abbas I from 1588 until 1629, when it's particularly powerful. One of the things that's really important here is this battle called the Battle of Chaldiran. It takes place roughly, I think it's like in Iraq or like Syria. It's pretty close to those areas, but it's in that general Fertile Crescent kind of area. It's between the Safavids and the Ottomans, and while the Ottomans technically win, it's not like a huge victory. They don't like advance on and conquer their enemies. What happens then is that after this battle is over, that sort of area is going to mark essentially where the Sunni and the Shia are going to split. So on each side of that battle, then, you're going to have Shia on one side, Sunnis on the other, and that's still basically true today. So you have this battle that takes place, 500 years ago, and it sort of ends up limiting the extent of these two different religions as they sort of get close to each other. They had a slave soldier group similar to the Janissaries. They were called, individually they're called Ghulam, but they are called Gilman soldiers as a whole. So very similar. They're going to have theirs from the Caucasus, not the Balkans. Textiles, a very important trade resource. So they have lots of like carpets and rugs, stuff like that. They eventually will collapse in the 1720s. They get attacked from outside, but also they have a lot of internal weakness. One of the problems that the Safavid, as well as the Ottomans, have is that they don't have a clear line of succession, right? Like who's going to take over. So one of the best things about monarchy, probably the only good thing about monarchy, is that you know who's going to take over, right? Generally. So you're going to have like the son or maybe the daughter or something is going to become the next king or queen. That can obviously cause problems when there's some question over who that is, but that doesn't happen all that often, so it's not too bad. The problem for these two Muslim empires is that essentially there's no primogeniture. It's not like the first son. It's usually supposed to be sort of like the most competent son to a degree, but there's also a lot of sons, right? Like they have multiple wives, they have concubines. So what happens then is that whenever the Sultan starts getting sick or like looks like he's going to die or something, there's just an utter bloodbath between all the brothers. Like in the Ottoman Empire in particular, like there's stories about people like strangling their toddler brothers and stuff, and like really just these utter massacres. And so what you end up having is not the most competent person to come out of this massacre. What you end up is having essentially the most vicious person come out of the massacre. So that leads to a lot of weak leaders, people who just don't really understand what they're doing because they are just brutal to each other. So that's one of the problems with the Safavid as well. All right, we got a great picture here for the Safavids. A couple things you can notice. Obviously, down here, we're going to see these rugs and stuff. So that's one of their key things that they have. I love these mustaches. Look at that bad boy. Whew, that is quite a mustache right there. They've got a couple guys around here with those kind of things. You'll also notice this is a picture from the time period. This is unusual because in Islam, we don't typically have pictures of human beings. Their art is typically very geometric in origin. But for whatever reason, Shia, specifically in Iran, haven't had as much of a problem with this. So you can actually even find from this period like images of the Prophet Muhammad, which is like real no-no in Islam, because they're just a lot different. So we see them as sort of an unusual and unique group who have amazing mustaches. Look at that dude. That's pretty great. All right, third of our Muslim gunpowder empires is going to be the Mughal. Mughal, based in India. They are founded in 1526 by a guy named Babur. He is the last in a long line of Muslim attacks on India. So this has been going on for quite a while. It's not like it's specific in the beginning. There's a whole bunch of people who come before them, Muhammad of Ghazni and just a bunch of these other Muslim leaders who are coming in and trying to conquer India. But they had largely held together okay. Like they've been able to defend themselves and keep some of the Muslim empires out. But in 1526, Babur, who is this Highland prince, basically, who is forced out of his territory, ends up invading with what troops he can. And he is going to conquer this territory. So he's the last in a long line of these Muslim attacks. And then he will end up founding a dynasty that will be pretty unique. One of the major and unique things about the Mughal is that they tried their best, really, most of them tried their best really to work within the system. So they tried to work with Hindu leaders and others. Wasn't always successful, and there's definitely ones, some of the Mughal empires, Mughal emperors did not do that at all. They were pretty terrible. But in general, they tried to do their best to kind of rule this area. The most famous of these rulers of the Mughal, at least in this time period, is known as Akbar. So he's pretty unique. He will end up fighting pretty extensively. He's going to extend the Mughal to the ends of the Indian subcontinent. This military power, again, is very land-based. These are not ocean-based peoples. He was extremely tolerant of Hindus. He married some Hindu wives. He appointed Hindus to the high levels of his administration. But some of his successors were not as much. So, for example, his, I think it's his son, Aurangzeb, really goes against his ideas. Actually, it's his grandson, I think. But regardless, one of his successors. He goes against this idea and causes some problems and some tensions. He's actually so involved in this sort of like syncretism kind of thing that he actually invents his own religion as a combination of Islam and Hinduism. It was called the Divine Faith. It was not popular. This is kind of like if you know like a crazy person who's just like, hey, I made a religion, but that crazy person happens to be in charge of an entire empire. That's what's going on here. So he's like, I made a new religion, and everyone's like, okay, sure, yeah, that sounds great. Let's do that religion and stuff, right? Please don't kill me. So what ends up happening instead then is that basically he has this thing, he creates a new capital, he does all this stuff, and the moment he dies, everyone just forgets it and just leaves it alone. Like nobody cares anymore after that. So kind of unique. One of his other successors is a guy named Shah Jahan. You may know him because of the Taj Mahal. So he built this tomb for his wife Mumtaz Mahal. And a couple of other things that are just sort of happening in this time period is this practice of known as sati, as well as child marriage. So child marriage was more common here. Sati is the practice where a widow will jump upon her husband's funeral pyre and kill herself. It's just as awful as it sounds, and it was kind of enforced through demands by the community. So not something that people necessarily wanted to do, but it was kind of an expectation. Sikhism was founded by Nanak in this period. So one of our major kind of world religions is founded in this period as well. It is also sort of syncretic, like it looks at both of these different kind of religions. Couple of images here for you. So we got the Mughal Empire. You can see the size of it. So at the death of Babur, we just basically have this Gangetic plain up here. Then by the death of Akbar, you're going to see it even larger. And then by the death of Aurangzeb, you'll see that they basically conquer the entirety of the Indian subcontinent. Here, of course, is the beautiful Taj Mahal. Again, this is essentially a tomb. So Mumtaz Mahal is buried in here, as is Shah Jahan. And it also sort of serves like you can see kind of a combination of a couple things. What's amazing about the Taj Mahal architecturally is that it is a combination of Islamic and Hindu influences. That's what's one of the things that's so important about the Mughals, is this attempt to kind of combine these two different things together. All right, we're going to move away from these Muslim gunpowder empires over to China. Man, that's terrible. Over to China, and specifically the Ming Dynasty. Now, we talked about the Ming Dynasty before now already, but just a little bit more about them, kind of as they're ending up, like kind of near the end of this period. The Ming were founded by Hongwu, as we mentioned before, former peasant, and they're very inward-looking. So scholar gentry are going to be in charge again, new exams, aristocratic families, Neo-Confucianism, etc., etc. One of the things that's important here, though, is that the Europeans start to kind of come there during the Ming Dynasty. So the Ming collapse in about 1644, and so before that, then, there's going to be a few Europeans like the British and the Dutch and some others who are coming to China, but they end up causing a big problem. Like, they're just like, getting off their boats and causing issues and things. And so the Chinese government basically says, you can come and trade, but only at these specific places. And so they open up a city called Canton and a city called Macau for the Portuguese, and Europeans could really only trade there, which really made the Europeans kind of mad. They were not big fans of this. Zheng He, again, his trips were canceled due to cost and the perception that the Chinese did not need to do them. Europeans came to the Chinese instead. So, as we just mentioned, trade is a big factor there, but also religion. So there's a big movement through a group of people called the Jesuits, who we'll learn about much more about very soon when we get to the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation. But a guy like Matteo Ricci is going to come, and they're going to try to convert people to Catholicism. And there are converts, but there's not a lot, and the Pope kind of gets mad at the way they're doing it, and so that sort of puts a problem there. So the Ming are going to decline due to some poor emperors over the ends of their period. It gets so bad that there's so much corruption that the infrastructure declines. People can't grow food. It literally gets to the point where peasants are like cannibals and they're selling their children as slaves and stuff. It's super, super bad. And so when the next dynasty comes in, the Qing, there will not be a huge opposition to them, even though they are not Chinese, just because things got so bad in this period. You can see here again the Ming Dynasty and sort of the size of it. You can see it's sort of down here below the Great Wall, the capital here of Nanjing, and some of the other important cities that are in there. This area up here, Manchuria, will become very important to the next dynasty, the Qing dynasty, because this is where the Qing rulers will come from. These are Manchurians. They're kind of the last of these sort of steppe groups that are going to come in and take over control of China. All right, so let's talk about these Qing. The Qing are going to take control after a peasant uprising in 1644. So there's an uprising, and the Manchus are going to use this as an attempt to invade. So these folks are not Chinese. They're of a different ethnicity, but the Chinese generally are okay with them because they are somewhat Sinicized. Like, they allow the Chinese to kind of do what they want to do, and they adopt a few Chinese concepts and things. After takeover, they will rule until 1911. They are a lot less tolerant than the Mongols. They're not a big fan of this kind of like cosmopolitanism. They will enforce their ideas, dress, and culture. Men, for example, were forced to wear this very specific hairstyle called a queue. And the Manchus were only put into high levels of office. But that being said, generally speaking, they kind of let China be China otherwise. Kangxi is one of the most famous of these Qing rulers and one of the most successful of all the Chinese emperors. Like, it is so good. He expands the empire, is pretty tolerant of Christians, incredibly literate. He actually published a bunch of books, including reorganizing the Chinese language in a new dictionary. Like, it's super impressive. He also basically gets a chance to sort of cancel the taxes a few years. Like, he's just like, no, we got enough money. I don't need all your taxes. Y'all enjoy. Have a party. Following up on that then, Qianlong was another famous Qing ruler. He will expand the borders and move, for example, out to Xinjiang province, out in the very, very west. He will limit British traders only to Canton. And he will also brutally repress the White Lotus Rebellion, which was an attempt to overthrow them, much like the previous White Lotus Rebellion. So you can see here the Qing area that they ruled. This is very similar to modern-day China, with the exception, of course, of like Mongolia and some of these areas. But essentially, modern-day China is the formation of that. Can you tell? Some people call it a chicken. Can you see that, right? So you got a little like head up here. You got the chicken breast. There's the tail feathers. It doesn't really have any feet, I guess, but you get it. So that's the area there. This is the hairstyle called a queue. So all men were essentially forced to wear this. You had to shave the front of your head and the sides. You had your hair back here, and you pulled it down into a braid. So when they declined in 1911, they fall apart. That's one of the first things people do is start cutting their hair. But you had to have that. So important part of their rulership. All right, let's take a look at Russia. Russia. I know we're running a little long here. We'll try to get through as much as we can. And I went too far. Let's go back here for Russia. Okay, so first off, we remember that the Mongols, or as they called them, the Tatars, or kind of the remnants of the Mongols, they are going to be under control of this area. And so one of the first of these Russian princes to break that control is Ivan III. It's part of the reason he's called the Great. So he is going to break from the Tatars to empower his empire. He will centralize control of the government. He will name himself Tsar, which is essentially like emperor. So it's kind of like Caesar. He will form a military government, and he will use these peasants called Cossacks that are these strong military forces instead. He will have a aristocracy called the Boyars. And again, Russia's going to be much like a lot of other places where they're kind of like back and forth between the power of the aristocracy and the power of the Tsar. But ultimately here, the Tsar is going to win. The Tsar is going to be in very powerful control. And part of that then is because of Ivan IV, the Terrible. So he essentially would try to destroy the aristocracy through a group called the Oprichniki. These are like kind of like crazy, like it's hard to describe what they are really. They're like secret police almost. They kind of look. Their descriptions sound like like the Nazgul from like Lord of the Rings. Like they wear like black robes and black armor, and they ride black horses. And they go whenever an aristocrat tries to oppose Ivan IV, they end up attacking them and they seize all their land. And so the Oprichniki ends up having this very powerful like amount of land because of this land they seize. But then of course the problem with that is that Ivan the Terrible is like, okay, you're too powerful, and so he destroys them near the end of his time. By the way, his name, the Terrible, in English that kind of means like awful or terrible person or something. It really means more like awesome, like powerful, right? Expansion was important during his time. He's going to expand the empire greatly. Ivan III and to some extent Ivan IV are going to try to reach out to the west for a bit, and there's some success in the short run, but in the long run it's not as successful as you would think. So we end up having a big issue here for Russia, though. So Ivan IV is going to kill his heir. Supposedly, he was having a relationship with his daughter-in-law. Yuck. And his son confronts him, and he basically beats his son and kills him by breaking his head open. And so that will end up causing a big problem. So his other son takes over, but is not particularly competent. And so that will end up leading to a time called the Time of Troubles, where essentially there is not a group to take over. This dynasty was called the Rurik dynasty, and there's nobody really to take over. And so a whole bunch of outside people end up trying to move in to control this area to kind of change Russia. So, for example, you have, the Swedes and the Poles and all these people essentially trying to support one person over another, or alternately to try to keep Russia really weak so that it can't become more powerful. It's pretty crazy too, by the way. So they have one of the people who died along the way was one of, I think it was like Ivan IV's grandson or something. He was a person named Dmitri. Regardless, he was he was supposed to be like the next in line, but he was not alive. So so what happens though is that we end up having a part of the Time of Troubles is called the War of the False Dimitris, because repeatedly people keep finding people and saying, "Oh, he lived. Dmitri lived. Here he is, right here. This is Dmitri." And then they would bring somebody forward who looks like nothing like Dmitri. Probably doesn't even speak Russian. It's just some dude, and everyone's like, "Okay, cool, that's Dmitri. Let's go fight the Russians." And so they would do this repeatedly. There's 2 or 3 people who declare themselves Dmitri and end up losing over time because the Russians are able to defeat them. So ultimately, then, because they are unable to find new people, the Boyars are going to get together. They're going to choose a guy named Michael Romanov as the new Tsar away from that former dynasty. And so this Romanov dynasty will essentially rule Russia until its fall. So when we talk about Peter the Great and others, those are the Romanovs, and we'll talk more about them later. A couple of quick pictures here for you. Again, you can see the expansion of Russia over time. So 1500 here, that's kind of the time period we're in. You're going to see it's not really that big necessarily, but it does expand in the 1600s to include some larger area here. 1700s, 1800s, it's pushing a little bit more. And then finally by about 1900, we have the modern day kind of areas of Russia, or the Soviet Union, really. Lastly, real quick, we got a couple pictures. This is going to be Ivan III the Great. You can see his beautiful, beautiful outfit here. One of the things that we're going to see, he looks very, very Russian. He's got this big old beard at the time. He's got these big, heavy robes because Russia's pretty cold. So this is an issue that Peter the Great and other rulers will take, that they want to be more Western-oriented. And so these are the kind of things that they will try to get rid of. Over here is a very famous painting. This is Ivan IV the Terrible, after he has killed his son, as he holds him there, and the sadness in his eyes. All right, folks. Well, that's it right there for us. Again, some of those major empires that we're talking about. We'll be talking about the French and the others later on. But for right now, we got these gunpowder empires. We got the Muslim empires, Safavids, Ottomans, Mughals. Let's put it over here. Mughals. We also then, of course, have Chinese dynasties, the Ming and the Qing, and we also have Russia as one of our other great sort of land empires here. Okay? All right. Hopefully that was helpful to y'all. I know we ran a little long, but hopefully it was pretty informative and fun. I'll talk to y'all later. Bye-bye.